Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to make a couple of comments before we get to our speaker. So for context, I think we have about 300 people on this call today. We've got Enerplus employees, and we've also got a group of industry leaders, producer community, service companies, some of our partners in finance, accounting, the legal community, all across Canada and the United States. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. The purpose of Enerplus hosting this call, it's pretty simple. It's a part of our commitment to be a positive and I guess constructive voice in the energy conversation. And so it starts with understanding how things work. And I know many of you are spending a significant amount of your time trying to educate people about the vital role oil and gas plays in our society, particularly now as energy policy, at least in the developed world, is increasingly focusing on how to transition to a lower carbon energy complex. I have found the work that Dr. Tinker does through his organization, Switch Energy Alliance, to be a really valuable resource, and we hope you will as well. So that brings me to the introduction. We are very pleased to have Dr. Scott Tinker with us today. For many of you, he needs no introduction. He is a globally trusted voice in this energy dialogue that we are having. And I don't know if there has ever been a time when we have had so great a need for nonpartisan, balanced, and objective voices. Dr. Tinker founded Switch Energy Alliance. It's a nonprofit which is dedicated to inspiring an energy-educated future. And I can tell you he is in high demand to share his insights. When I think about him first and foremost as a trusted educator. Given the fact that energy literacy is so low and the challenges of transitioning to lower carbon intensity so significant, it's no wonder he's a busy guy. His work truly does have global reach. From the work he does educating children, I think he's been in front of hundreds of thousands of children. There's created some strong content for the classroom, to the work that he does with legislators. As you may know, he recently appeared before the U.S. Senate committee talking about energy and climate. I would highly recommend his testimony in the follow-on Q&A. I think if you could cut and paste that, that would be a good starting point for U.S. energy policy. I guess that's my opinion. The website has a tremendous content, which he shares gratis. Again, it's the Switch Energy Alliance. And then finally, as a nonprofit, he is always open-minded to financial support, either personally or corporately. If you do have a chance to think about supporting this work, I personally think it is an excellent organization and worthy of considering. So, logistics. Dr. Tinker's talk is 45 minutes, and then we will have some time for Q&A. Given the numbers we're dealing with, we're on a Teams live event, so that means you have to type a question using the Q&A feature. And my colleague, Wade Hutchings, who's our COO, will moderate. Finally, we are going to record this, so if you find it valuable and you want to share it with others, we will make it available. And so thank you. With that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Scott Tinker.
Well, thanks, Ian. It's really good to be with you all today. And I thought you told me 4 hours for the talk, so I'll try to trim it back in real time. But thanks for the pitch, too. The Switch Energy Alliance is something that I'm passionate about. The Bureau of Economic Geology is my day job, and it has a lot to do with this, too. So let's get started. What do we want energy to do? We want energy to be cheap. We want it to be reliable. We want it to be clean. You know, it's magical almost, these things. It's aspirational, certainly. Wouldn't it be nice if it could be all of those things? And as you look around the world at some of the big issues facing the world today, you can see, I don't have poverty on the list, but many of these things are related to poverty. And then you see energy here, of course, and climate change, and some are painting climate change or energy. I don't think of them that way. You also have the land, the air, and the water. Together, land, air, water, and climate make up our environment, and energy and the economy. And these are the things, these are the conjunctive things. So when you think about energy being cheap, it's really the economy, and reliable is really the energy, and clean is the environment. So we put these together, and that overlap space, if we could get it right, would be equitable. We could figure out how to provide equitable energy to the world. So what is cheap? Well, it certainly involves the volatility of the price, and we're quite comfortable thinking about volatility in oil price, and it's very real. The Great Recession had a big impact, so has COVID-19. It went negative at one point in time. But you might not think about copper for wind turbines as another commodity that has a volatile price structure, or perhaps cobalt for batteries, which is also quite volatile in its price. In fact, all subsurface resources are quite volatile in their pricing, and all forms of energy require subsurface resources. Now, cheap also means affordable to who? Well, to the customer. Here's the levelized cost of energy, and you see that solar and wind have come down and below coal now, and so that's the true statement, and in fact below natural gas, the LCOE. But it's completely factual, but it's not quite factually complete. And those are different things. When you look at a map of the US, you see that some states pay a lot more for electricity than others. In fact, these numbers are even low compared to what the actual customer pays. And why is that? Well, it's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Here I am quoting Aristotle. My simple reduction of that, entertain a thought without accepting it, is critical thinking. To think critically about the pros and cons of different issues. And here's a good example of non-critical thinking. Damn it,
Scott.
Yeah.
Sorry to this. I think you're probably referencing slides right now, would be my guess.
Oh yeah.
And we can't see those, so I think you have to share your screen. There we go.
Oh, my great slides.
This is a classic Dundas move. So I have some empathy for you.
Yeah. Okay, let's try that again. And you waited very politely till about slide number 10 to interrupt me.
Yeah, sorry about that. Another
No
Dundas.
worries. So why don't I just start over, but I'll go very quickly because these are such brilliant slides. Can you see them now?
We are all good. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So here we go. We want energy to be cheap, reliable, and clean. And again, that's almost magical or aspirational, certainly, to have all of those things. And when you look at the big issues in the world, there are many. And these are the ones related to poverty I've made orange, but energy and climate, sometimes painted as conflicting. When you add land and air and water, you're really talking about the environment and energy and the economy. So cheap, reliable, and clean are about the economy. They're about energy and they're about the environment. So you bring all those together, and it's that overlap space that I love to play in, and that's where equitable energy is going to happen. Price can be volatile. What does cheap mean? So here's WTI, helps to see the graph, and you can see that Great Recession and COVID-19 took quite negative because demand went far down, but you probably don't think about volatility of copper and its price structure, or cobalt for batteries. And again, any earth resource can be quite volatile in its pricing, and all forms of energy need earth resources. Also affordability, so the levelized cost. Yes, indeed, wind and solar have come down, and it's remarkable and very positive, below coal and natural gas. Completely factual, but not factually complete. When you actually look at the whole cost to the consumer or retail, you see a very big difference. And those with heavy renewable energies in their portfolio are often more expensive. So again, Aristotle, mark of an educated mind, and I think he's really talking about critical thinking here. So I'm glad you stopped me right then, Ian, because you can't get this joke unless you see the picture. Damn it, the boat should have gone in first. That's non-critical thinking. So what is the cost of intermittency? Well, it requires backup to be reliable. Either load following plants like natural gas, which follow the load, and those are redundant and are expensive. Storage like batteries, and that's a scale challenge. Dispersing renewables all around, and that's an area of access issue, and then combining sources, which is timing. All of these strategies are talked about, but none of them are very cheap. So intermittent solar and wind require expensive backup to make them reliable, and that makes them more expensive. So we really need to talk about the consumer cost of energy to get closer to what we need to be discussing. Now, what is reliable? Well, intermittent is part of it. This is the demand curve, and it's something that's so important. This is Texas for a week in the summer. The demand goes way up in the day and down at night. Here's the wind in Texas. It rarely cooperates with the demand because it comes on pretty strong in the evenings. So when you have high energy demand but not much wind, the price spikes for electricity, and this always happens. I'll talk about the big chill in a minute, but it goes up substantially. It's an energy market. So that demand curve and timing and dispersion and backup matters. Balancing demand and supply requires a portfolio of generation options to be reliable. Now, reliability also means available 24/7, 365, right? We ideally or aspirationally, but at what cost? So this is a picture right out my window, right there, just a couple weeks ago. Things looked a little different than they do now. The big chill in Texas. I've shown the freezing line, and here's the temperature going along pretty typical, and then it fell. That's the high in Dallas and the low being below freezing and way down to almost zero for that week. Here's the energy mix. You've read a lot about this, I'm sure. This is just the data. The orange is wind. Wind is variable in the summer and the winter, so it comes and goes, and we back it up with gas. That's the green. So when the wind is not blowing much, we have a lot of gas come on, and this is a pretty typical week, and even coal in the dark blue does that, and nuclear, which we have in Texas, 4 reactors, steady on at the bottom in light blue. Now what happened? And by the way, we don't use as much wind or solar in the winter. It's not as good. The sun's low on the horizon, etc., and the days are short, so it's not as windy. So what happened when it started to get cold? Well, wind and solar were cut more than in half. Some of them froze up, etc. Coal hung in there, as did nuclear, and natural gas just kept rising day on day to where combined it reached the extreme demand forecast peak, 67 gigawatts, the most we thought we would ever need in the winter. And we hit it. Nothing had failed yet, but it was close. So natural gas did a remarkable job, more than doubling there. And then it continued to get colder. Some coal went offline as it froze, a nuclear reactor. Solar and wind essentially went away, and natural gas decreased quite a bit as well from the highest peak in the natural gas. And we started to have rolling blackouts. Now, look, it made things expensive, slammed by $1,000 power bills. Natural gas is the culprit. Solar and wind are tanked. Isolated grids the problem. ERCOT and their damn planning. Energy markets versus capacity markets. The equipment needs to be more resilient. Cost upgrade. Climate change is the problem. You know, the challenge is, will this freeze event cause permanent change or not? Now, if finger pointing were renewable, we'd have energy to last forever in Texas. And there's a lot of finger pointing still going on as we try to figure that out. What does clean mean? Clean talks about CO2 emissions. In fact, it's binary in some conversations today. CO2 emissions. Young people like this, save the planet, save Earth, save yourself. It's all about carbon, either carbon or not, okay? There's also local air that matters, though. In our film Switch On, Sana Kanchi, cooking indoors with wood. The local air matters a lot to her. It turns out it matters to about 1/3 of the world's population, 2.6 billion who still cook inside with biomass. This is killing about 3 million people every year, about 0.1% of those cooking this way. 3 million people is more than malaria and AIDS combined. It's more than COVID killed in 2020, every single year. And it's so solvable. And how about the land and the water, the pillars of the environment? Took this picture in Kibra outside of Nairobi. You can see young people coming home from school in their uniforms over massive piles of garbage that are always there. The soil is polluted. The water is polluted. Local air challenges. So cheap, reliable, and clean. We'd like to have these things, but man, it's tough to get all three. In terms of stage of the economy, cheap energy is needed in emerging economies. Reliable is needed in developing economies. And in the wealthy world, the developed economies, we're talking about clean. So the conversation is quite different. How does that look? This is a map of global income. And what you see on the low end is $1,000 a year to $4,000 per year. And the yellows and reds are all over the world, but they're concentrated here, and they need cheap energy. Now, as you move into what's called upper middle, that's up to $12,000 a year. That's not much in US or Canadian terms. They need reliable energy to keep developing. And then finally on the wealthy end, more than $12,000 a year, it's kind of isolated, isn't it? The blue areas, and we want it clean, okay? So reliable, cheap, and clean. It depends on where you are and where you are in your economic development. We made this film called Switch On. We went to the countries that are featured in emerging and early developing economies, and I hope you have a chance to get to look at it. But what does it mean? What does little to no energy really mean? Well, there's three kinds of people in the world. Those who are good at math and those who aren't. So let's do some simple arithmetic. This is the per capita consumption of electricity every year by people, by a person. Ethiopia and Kenya are highlighted in yellow. We film those and switch on. You might not speak kilowatts, so let's compare it to my fridge, which consumes 9 times more electricity than the average person in Ethiopia, and 3 times more than the average person in Kenya. That's energy poverty. When you start to look at poverty, $3 a day, so just over $1,000 a year by electrification rate, in different parts of the world, here's Latin America, with Brazil being the greatest population. It's mostly electrified, and about 20% severe poverty. Now, Asia, a lot more people, China and India dominating, but other big economies as well, less electrified, more poverty, and another 1.1 billion in Africa, showing Kenya and Ethiopia again, a lot less electrified, more severe poverty. So this correlation exists between poverty and coming out of poverty and electrifying your economy and rising up. It presents a dilemma or a paradox. Energy won't end poverty, but you can't end poverty without energy. It's time to power the people. So equitable, access to affordable and reliable energy, which underpin a healthy economy and a clean environment. That's equitable. And energy, the economy, and the environment all have to play here. Energy underpins a healthy economy. We've looked at some data, and you have to have a healthy economy to invest substantially in the environment and clean it up. I've been in 65 countries in the world, and without exception, the dirtiest environments are where it's poor: the water, the land, and the local air. Affordable, reliable, available energy, poverty, competition, and growth, air, atmosphere, land, and water. It's complicated, isn't it? Social, legal, political systems, they're very interactive. You can't underestimate the complexity. I call it the radical middle. It's radically lonely sometimes, but that is where the action is, and it's not easy. It's where we're going to solve this, though. The sustainable energy transition is going to happen in that radical middle. So let's talk about transitions and some of the big things involved in them: energy density, technology and access, wealth and scale, reliability, public opinion, natural events. It's not binary by any means. We're going to see some data on a lot of these different things. So here's one of the early transitions. We were cooking with wood and heating ourselves back over 1,000 years ago, and we used the sun to grow fuel, and the engines hauled their own fuel back then, and we used it to eat. And motion from water to grind mill, and motion from the wind to lift water up. And we used whales to light our lamps. And then we used bigger wheels. We call them dams or hydro facilities. And then more engines hauling their own food, if you will, coal. And coal is a solid fuel. When you burn it, you can boil water on the stove or in big power plants to turn on the lights. And then along came liquid fuels and oils, and they allowed for transportation of different kinds and a whole lot of other things, followed by natural gas, which is the most versatile fuel of all, and nuclear right in here. So we can see this transition from left to right is really one of power density or energy density. Very low density on the left side of the graph, and very high density as you move right, hundreds of times more dense as you move to the right. So on the left, we see things that are called renewable. They're low density, but the sun and the wind and the rain, etc. Thermal on the right-hand side. Other words are clean and dirty. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Or intermittent and dispatchable. The sun and the wind aren't always there, but you can always burn things as long as it's not frozen to dispatch electricity. So again, another transition that's going on here is away from carbon-based fuels, wood, biomass of different kinds, and coal, to hydrocarbons, oil, to natural gas, mostly hydrogen, CH4, to even a methane or a hydrogen economy. And then finally to uranium and thorium for nuclear. And that's a fascinating transition. Higher density from left to right, lower carbon. In fact, we've been going lower carbon naturally as a more dense energy transition. But we decided along the way, the sun and the wind that were good hundreds to thousands of years ago are going to be good again. Bigger wind turbines and solar collectors of different kinds. So that's going to drive an interesting challenge into this physics system. Instead of higher density, we're going to have lower density for lower carbon. And that's not going to be as easy as we think. It's doable, but but let's talk about it. So when you think about high density coal, I'm sure this is Beijing, you probably think of the particulates in the air, and that's very real. And oil, pump jacks and drilling wells and refineries and other kinds of big industrial processes. Natural gas, including the drilling and the pipelines to move it to where it needs to be, and nuclear, the power plants, and that steam coming from the cooling towers there, but big industrial processes. It's not trivial. They have an impact on the environment, the mining and manufacturing to build the things to collect the energy, the drilling and completion, handling the water to recycle or dispose it, to move the energy in pipes, trucks, ships, and rail, refining and petrochemicals, and finally burning it. This is energy intensive, it's environmentally impactful. It's getting better in wealthy countries, not so much in the emerging economies. Now, just today, this just published this morning, Big Tobacco had to pay $206 billion. Is big oil next? And relating oil to cigarettes. Now, the last time I checked cigarettes, the redeeming value of cigarettes compared to, let's say, living longer, transporting ourselves around, better medical facilities, growing more food, the wealth that's been created by energy, there's some remarkably positive things that come from oil, but there are also impacts. But it's an interesting strategy to compare it to cigarettes, and it's going on a daily basis. What do you think of when you think of solar? Let's look at some of the low density. Picture something in your mind when you think of solar. Did you picture this? Did you picture the polysilicon plant that required to make the solar panels? How about wind? Did you picture this? Did you picture 100 turbines cut into thirds being buried in Wyoming? And let's put wind guy to scale here. These are massive blades, about 100 cut into thirds. We have 13,000 of those blades in Texas today. Or sorry, 13,000 turbines, 39,000 turbine blades. Where are they going to go? Because they do wear out. And what do you picture when you think of an electric vehicle? This Coloradan, where you all are, thinks no oil. They don't have tires maybe or plastic in the car. But, you know, do they think of this? Do they think of a lithium mine when you see an electric vehicle? You should, because a lithium ion battery is what's required to run those cars. And it's not just one. It actually takes 7,000 of those to run one Tesla S. 7,000 lithium ion batteries. How many Tesla S batteries are required to electrify the total vehicle fleet in the world today, which some people want to do in the next 20 to 30 years? How many? Simple math. It takes about 8 trillion. So let's just look at it. Here's a US football field. We're going to cover it end to end, 3-inch long and 1-inch diameter lithium ion batteries from a Tesla S. Turns out that's 2.7 million. They're about an inch thick. So let's start stacking an inch at a time, 2.7 million lithium ion batteries from a Tesla S. How high does this tower go to electrify the world's vehicle fleet? It turns out it goes about 50 miles into the mesosphere. It goes off this graph, 8 trillion batteries, 50 miles. It's a tower of solid batteries, and they wear out, and we have to do it again. Now, I'm going to name it Musk Tower because he's the guy. So it's time to get serious about recycling lithium-ion batteries. Sure it is. This is out of a recent article, but we only recycle about 5% today. For reasons of technical, economic, and other factors, that's pretty true about a lot of recycling. It's actually cheaper to make things new. So they're going to go mostly into landfills. Who owns all the stuff to do this? Well, China does. China owns about 60% of the lithium capacity, 70% of the cobalt. They're growing in nickel. They own over 50% of the polysilicon now and growing dramatically. And in fact, the human rights abuses from this kind of mining is real. And it's happening in the emerging and developing economies because they don't have the same regulatory schemes that we do. They're not wealthy yet. How about on the lower density end? It turns out there's impact there too. Mining and processing for all the stuff, manufacturing of the panels and blades, production on the land and the land farms. You got to move the electricity and then it goes into landfill. It's a big industrial process. Mining, manufacturing, and disposing is not renewable. The sun and the wind are, but the stuff to collect them isn't renewable. And depending on how you define clean, if you include land, air, and water, It's not clean either. It's going to be a while, though, before you see this article. Are big renewables next? You know, I don't think the E&E reporter is ready to write that quite yet, but it's quite analogous. So here we come back to critical thinking for equitable energy. What's the challenge? Well, it's really one of transitions, isn't it? To leave the 3E world there in the middle and make some transitions. What do they look like? What drives them? Well, there are a couple of three types that I've identified. One is event-driven, a nature or natural, economic or technological events, and they're fairly unpredictable. Resource-driven, power density, scale, access, like we've talked about, these tend to be sustained transitions. And then policy-driven, public opinion, energy security, and these are pretty cyclic. It depends on who's in power, doesn't it? So let's look at some around the world. All my slides are color-coded. Gray is coal, green is oil, red is natural gas, and orange is nuclear, blue is hydro, and the sun and the wind are yellow and orange, okay? So here's Brazil. A lot of oil in green and a lot of hydro in blue. Some natural gas. Demand is kind of flattened the last 5 years, but they've had tough economic times. Now, here's the consumption is flattened. Here's the CO2 emissions, and I'll put this on every graph. So they've been rising and they kind of flattened as the energy consumption flattened. This is a resource-driven transition still in Brazil. Now, you might think Brazil is the leader in biofuels in the world. They are. But look at it. That's the light green. That's the total biofuel component of Brazil's energy. It's just a small portion. Scale really matters. In all things energy, scale matters. Let's take a look at Japan, a very different transition. Fukushima Daiichi happened. This is an event. They didn't replace it with coal or oil for power. They replaced it mostly with natural gas and then started developing some solar and wind several years later. So the event-driven change here has lasted at least a decade, and Japan is still deciding which way to go. Norway, a lot of oil, steady on, and a lot of hydro developed on that. We started our first film Switch with the word Norway. Norway, energy so clean you can drink it. So consumption is pretty flat in Norway, and you see a lot of hydro. They have a great resource there, CO2 emissions. So it's a resource-driven transition. Coming to India, a lot of growing coal. This isn't just electricity, total energy, a lot of oil, and very little of anything else so far. Growing in demand. Remember, this is an emerging economy. Consumption is growing, CO2 emissions are growing. It's a resource-driven transition. Germany has something very different. Just the electricity part. Coal was flat and coming down a little. Natural gas was growing. Nuclear was steady. And everything else was sort of steady. A little bit of wind started to grow. Consumption was going up. Emissions were coming down. That's remarkable because they were changing the energy mix. And then something happened. Consumption went flat, and so did CO2 emissions, which is weird. You know, if consumption goes flat, you'd think emissions would go down more, but no, Fukushima happened. CO2 emissions flat, fracking in Fukushima. They got scared of those. So they created a policy called Energiewende to reduce nuclear natural gas. You can see the red and the orange much lower here than here. And by so doing, they needed to add more coal for base load. So the intention was good. And in the last couple of years, they've lowered their demand, which is nice, efficiency, and emissions are starting to come back down a little bit again. But the outcome was not what was intended. And these guys had good intentions. They were putting in posts to keep from parking next to the building. They forgot where they parked, you know, and policy does this too. We put in these policy posts and we sometimes struggle to remove them. We forget the policy parking space. Now, France is remarkable. France was growing in oil and gas early, but they don't have that much. So it went down and it got replaced by nuclear, by policy. And not much else in the mix in France, is there? Now, consumption is coming down, good on France, efficiency there, but it's a policy-driven transition. And their CO2 emissions have been flat and coming down. France, don't shut down your nuclear because of European pressure. That would be ridiculous. You have the cleanest, lowest emission electricity in the European Union, okay? China, wow, this is all energy, coal. All other forms of energy are less than coal in China, not power, all energy. Add them all up, less than coal, actual generation. Now look at the emissions as a result of that. Initially it was resources, then China had coal policy. We're going to build a lot of coal to make cheap electricity. And it continues. They released their next 5-year plan this week, and it has a bunch of coal still in it, contrary to what the chairman said in the UN less than a year ago. Now here's China. Let's lay Norway, which we've already seen, on top of China. It's all blue and it's clean. It's hydro. What's missing here? Well, what's missing here is scale. I'm going to scale Norway the same as China. There we go. Wow, Norway went away. In fact, China produces more solar energy, that little thin yellow thing today, than all of Norway's total energy consumption. It's just a completely different game when it comes to the amount of demand for 1.4 billion people versus about 7 million. Now, China compared to India, look at the mix in China and look at the mix in India. Very similar. A lot of coal and oil, a little bit of natural gas, about the same population. But India consumes less than a third of the energy that China is consuming today. In fact, you have to slide India to the left 25 years to get where China was back in 1995. India is going to pass China in population, but 25 years in terms of the consumption and the energy mix. What India does is going to be really important. And right now, they're looking at more coal. They're really not that keen on nuclear. It's going to be fascinating. The United States looks like this. This is electricity now, not total energy. Coal's been growing a little bit. Natural gas was growing. Nuclear was growing as well. This is about 2006 or 7, and there's the renewables. And then CO2 emissions were kind of growing and a little bit flat as we added more nuclear and natural gas and flattened the coal. And then something happened. The Great Recession, not much, a little bit of an event. In fact, globally, it didn't have much of an impact, a couple years. Our emissions are coming down, and yet consumption is flat. How's that happening? That's the opposite of Germany, right? Well, this little thing called fracking happened. Natural gas became abundant and cheap, and it was replacing coal big time. Look at the replacement of red and gray there. And then renewables were growing as well, solar and wind from state policy. So this is a resource transition in the US. When Paris happened in 2015, the Obama administration's proposal was the Clean Power Plan. We didn't implement it. The goal was to reduce emissions out of the power sector 32% by 2030. We achieved that in 2020, and not because of COVID. A decade early, the Clean Power Plan achieved its goals for Paris, but we didn't sign it. Who knew that? The policy might have even slowed that transition because natural gas and renewables were remarkable replacing coal. So now let's add it all up. The global electricity generation. Here's coal, there's oil, there's natural gas growing tremendously. Nuclear is still growing, hydro is growing, solar, wind, and everything else. 271% since 1985. That's almost 3x growth in demand for electricity since 85. And it turns out only natural gas and the renewables, which are hard to calculate a percentage because they didn't exist in 85 for the most part. But natural gas has grown much faster, not everything else. Now, if you look at the coal component of that, look at North America and Europe's coal. It's coming way down. It's been cut in half. Who's growing in coal? Wow, Asia. And the rest of the world essentially has no coal. It's a phenomenal difference between coal in Asia and the rest of the world. Now here's natural gas. Natural gas is growing in every geopolitical sector. It's sort of flat in Europe. The gas to coal ratio is 38% back in 85. It's 62%, 2/3 today, and continues to grow in ratio, natural gas to coal, for power generation. That's a good thing. Now, if you look at global electricity again, and let's look at it compared to solar and wind. Look at the growth rate of solar and wind. Your kids will learn in school. Solar and wind are growing faster than any other form of electricity, and they are. They're growing exponentially. It's remarkable, much faster than the total demand, which is still steep. But what does that miss? Our favorite S word. It misses scale. So let's scale these the same. Now here's solar and wind scaled the same. They're right in the data. Over the last 15 years, we've been able to exponentially grow solar and wind by building the best resources first, the best sun and the best wind. Over that same 15-year time frame, the growth in demand for electricity globally is nearly 8,500 terawatt hours, actual generation, not capacity, generation, of which solar and wind satisfied just under 25% of that growth. You say that again. The sun and the wind satisfied less than 25%, less than a quarter of just the growth in electricity demand globally, not to mention any of the base. This is the challenge of scale. Now, when you look at China, they consume the most electricity. US is next. This is by country. 2012, and here's 2018. China continues to go, and India more. There's somebody missing. Who's missing? Well, number 3 turns out it's the tech sector. More electricity than any nation on earth, except for China and the US. What does that look like? Well, it looks like this. We are all on our cell phones. The kids are on them. I took this picture at my daughter's soccer game. We weren't watching it. The pets are on them. Everybody's on cell phones. What's the forecast for tech sector electricity? Now, this is one, and the tech sector doesn't necessarily like it, but it's in a reasonably decent journal. Big components, the data centers in green, consumer devices, consumer and technology, and networks in blue. Here we are today at 2020, 2021. It could go up 2 or 3 times. All the solar and the wind in the world generates just over 2,000 terawatt hours. Tech is consuming close to 3,000 now. More than the sun and the wind combined. When we go off promising to go carbon neutral, if your plan is to buy offsets or credits, they're not enough to go around from solar and wind. They have to come from somewhere else. The cloud and everything else produces a lot of CO2 emissions. It's no wonder they called it a cloud. They probably wish they could rename that now. But here's the global energy scene now, not just electricity. This is a map of the world's population. Every color is about 1.1 billion people. We're not evenly distributed. The energy mix looks like this. Coal and oil, the foundational energies for transportation electricity, is still about 60% in the world. Solar and wind are about 3% and growing. North America looks like this. We've been flat for a couple decades, and it's about 49% coal and oil and 4% solar and wind. Europe, flat and coming down, good for Europe, more efficient. 50% coal and oil still, and 7% solar and wind. Russia, big drop, but slowly rising. A lot of red in Russia, natural gas. Coal and oil are just 36%, a lot of natural gas, and essentially no solar and wind. Pretty low latitude for the sun. South and Central America, emerging economies are growing in their demand. And a lot of it is coming from coal and oil, 47%, a lot of natural gas, and a lot of hydro, topography and rainfall in blue. 3% solar and wind. Africa, growing in demand, just emerging now. So steady growth. A lot of coal and oil there, just emerging, 64%, and 2% solar and wind. The Middle East is growing steeply in demand, and it's all oil and natural gas. There's no coal in the Middle East to speak of. It's 47% oil, the rest natural gas, starting to develop some solar and 1 nuclear reactor. No solar and wind yet. Southeast Asia, look at the colors on the map. 1, 2, 3, 4 billion people. Half the world's population. Growing steeply in demand as they emerge and develop. 75% coal and oil, 3% solar and wind. Now, if I shrink and grow these to be proportional to demand, you see that half the world's population is getting half of its energy from coal, 2 3/4 from coal and oil. Way more than the rest of the world combined. And now you understand this graph. Back from 65 to today, demand has gone up over 300%. We're starting to introduce options, but mostly it's driven by resources availability, a little bit of coal policy in China, a little bit of renewable policy in the world. Boy, the 2009 Great Recession, not much of an event. We'll see what COVID does permanently, okay? What else is growing? Population. We're going from almost 8 billion now to what, 9, 10, maybe even 11. We consume energy. Here's the world's energy consumption. That is correlation causation. And you'll hear the world could be wind and water and solar if it was just for policy. Just make it policy. By when? Here it is out to 2065, all solar, wind, and hydro, 98% renewable. Some are saying 2040 now. How does that look to you? I mean, realistically, how does that graph look to you? Maybe it'll be 20 or 75% by 2065, maybe 50%, 50-50, maybe just 25% renewable. A business as usual scenario, here's that exact graph spread out. Is that business as usual? Well, let's take a look at it, not in units, but in the mix, in the global mix as a percentage. Same exact data, but here it is spread across from 65 to 65. Look at the left and look at the right. 78% coal and oil down to 37, cut in half. Natural gas and nuclear double. Renewables go up fourfold in that time frame. That won't be that easy, actually, because of the scale of the demand itself. But the left side of that graph looks nothing like the right in terms of global energy mix. And it's really one driven by carbon to hydrocarbons to methane to uranium and thorium and hydrogen. It's mostly resources. There's some policy here and there's some policy there. Now, when I look by region, North America and Europe are flat again. This is total energy. Asia is growing tremendous, and the rest of the world is just getting started. So there's your total energy mix. There's the emissions from that mix, CO2 emissions. Again, North America and Europe are flat and coming down. Asia has gone up, up, up. Asia emits more CO2 than the rest of the world combined now. Bad Asia, I can't believe they're doing that. Why is Asia doing that? Well, here's why. Above the red line, we consume more stuff than we produce, and below the red line produces more than they consume. And the bottom is CO2 emissions. The United States emits 5 billion tons of CO2 every year, and we consume more stuff than we produce. China emits 10 gigatons, but it produces more than it consumes. China is a non-OECD nation, a non-rich club. All the dark blues are non-OECD, producing more than they consume for the most part. And all the greens are consuming, okay? Consuming a lot more than they produce for the most part. So what's happening? The producers are sending stuff to the consumers. We have moved manufacturing to other countries. And effectively, we're saying, hey, you make the stuff, you emit the CO2 using coal, and we'll be green. You know, that's kind of a zero emission strategy to buy offsets or to export manufacturing. How many atmospheres are there in the world? There's one, just one. And on a per product basis, actually more CO2 per product comes out of here than it does in regulated economies. It's not helping the climate. So how can China and Asia address CO2? One big strategy is to think about the coal gas mix. Right now, China has 11, almost 12x coal to gas, not just power, total. The rest of Asia, non-China, is a 3.2 coal to gas. United States is 0.6 coal to gas. Now, Jimmy Carter pushed us toward coal with policy during the first Arab embargo, and then fracking brought us back to gas. So a lot of interesting perturbations here. But what if China could go to the same CO2 coal to gas ratio as the US? That would reduce aggregate emissions by nearly 2 billion tons a year. Nothing else we're doing approaches that number. 5 billion down from coal, 3 billion up from gas, a net of almost 2 billion. The rest of Asia, another near billion would come out. The aggregate of that is almost 3 billion tons a year for Asia switching from coal to gas. It's a lot of natural gas that's going to be needed, or they could replace coal with nuclear or some combination for dispatchable baseload. Nonetheless, there are people in the world that don't like gas. It's a fossil fuel, even though it's mostly hydrogen. You've seen these things, you're sitting outside warming yourself, heating the atmosphere directly. I took this picture in Aspen because there they really don't like global warming. It's right on the propane tank. It tells you so. So reducing CO2, natural gas with carbon capture, nuclear, coal with capture, geothermal and hydro, centralized wind, distributed renewables. These are the big ones. These are some big wedges that could happen at scale and now, along with efficiency and conservation. Like Europe is doing, they've come down in energy consumption. Remarkably, the rest of the world can follow. So on a demand per capita basis, which is very different, The North America consumes the most energy per person of any country or any region. Now, but the aggregate, we're coming down, North America and Europe combined, and the rest of the economies that are emerging are going up on a per capita basis. They're not as high as we are yet. Look at Asia, Africa, and South and Central America combined. Per capita, how many people are in the world? About 7.7 billion. The same color scheme, over 3/4 of the world live in Africa, Asia, and South and Central America. And they're not consuming much energy per person yet, but it's 3/4 of the people. Here they are, Africa, Asia, Central and South America. They're developing, they're emerging. They want to and need to get energy to do that. Because these kids with a school with 2 light bulbs now are learning how to read. And they're learning how to, in English, the past and present tense. And they're wanting to better themselves. And so are their parents. So they don't have to shave their heads to keep the lice away in the slums in which they live. Energy, the economy, and the environment. It's the radical middle, that overlap space. It seems to be shrinking sometimes, and especially in the US and Western Europe. We got to grow it. We've got to bring these things together and have those important, tough conversations. Reduce impacts of all energy on the atmosphere, the air, the land, and the water, those 4 pillars of the environment. End energy poverty. Build a global economy. Affordable, reliable, available energy. You bring all that together, it's equitable and it's sustainable. It requires nonpartisan energy education and critical thinking. Here's a map of the world at night. Remarkable photo. Where are the lights on? They're on where there's energy. Here's the amount of energy consumed in each of those regions. Now you know why the lights are on. And some are proposing to take coal and oil and natural gas and uranium and thorium out of the mix. Well, first of all, will China and Russia and the Middle East and Africa, I mean, even the North America and Europe, will we do that? Should we do that? What happens when you remove 90% of the energy from the mix? Essentially, you turn off the lights. Let's dim the lights of the world by 90%. How's that look to you? To me, it looks like the past. Let's come into the present and start going toward the future, where we bring hunger and solve, address clothing, shelter, and clean water with energy, education, lights at night in schools, healthcare with refrigerators and freezers for medicines and vaccines. Women are going for the water, cooking indoors with wood. They're differentially impacted by energy poverty. Empowerment and freedom of women. Immigration and migration from autocracies where they can't find hope or economic growth. Population is directly tied to education, and education is underpinned by energy. Environmental investment. Energy, the economy, investing in the environment. Clean air, clean soil where it's wealthy. Climate adaptation and mitigation. You bring all these together, and that changes the world, okay? And I think that's what all of us in the energy business are trying to do. So I want to thank you for your attention today and thank my colleagues at the Bureau, where we bring energy, the environment together, and the economy, doing deep global research. And of course, go to Switch On, check us out. And Ian, thanks for the plug. I give money too, but it's all done with gifts, and we make everything else free. So appreciate your attention today, and I'm happy to address any questions or comments you might have.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was really a fantastic presentation. An immense amount of data and insight in just a few minutes. So thank you. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing and for being with us today. We do have a set of questions and people want to hear from you. So let's get right to it. We'll start with maybe an easy one. Is there one fact you share with people that you think is the most impactful in getting them to change or getting them to care about the energy transition challenge?
I think the one fact, if I had 1 minute on an elevator, would be that the transition is different around the world. And it's not away from one kind of fuel to another. It's away from poverty and toward prosperity. And that will let us clean up the environment.
Thanks, Scott. Back to the big freeze that you talked about in Texas.
Did somebody record that? Because I've never said that way. And that sounded really damn good, but I want to listen to it later because it might be completely stupid. So
we do have it recorded, yes.
Yeah, phew. Sorry.
So Scott, to the big freeze in Texas, you know, often we have big events in the world and we think they will cause radical change, and a few weeks or months later, it just fades away. Do you think that will have an effect in Washington, D.C. and other policy centers?
That's interesting. I mean, first to the big freeze, it's going on now. I mean, it's really a cost-benefit analysis when you get right down to it, and I don't want to be too economic about it, but is the cost of winterizing all the equipment in Texas worth the benefit? If we do that, that cost is going to be passed through to the ratepayers eventually. And is it worth it for something that might happen every 10 or 20 or 30 years? Should we put air conditioners everywhere in Montana for the occasional really hot week in the summer? Same kind of conversation, or in Canada. So that's what's going on, or at least needs to go on, is a rigorous cost-benefit analysis with everything on the table. Right now, it's still finger pointing. Do I think it's going to change in DC? I don't know. I mean, the pendulum swung so far from the right to the left, and I don't think Mr. Biden thinks that way necessarily, but some of his voter base does, and some of the people he's putting in place. So I don't know. I hope it comes back. You know, I was pleased and proud to testify, and Senator Manchin is a thoughtful guy, moderate, and really gets it, seems to get it. So, and there are a lot of moderate senators on both sides of the aisle. I hope there are congressional representatives as well that come in there and really start to digest this so that we don't go too far out in any particular direction. I'm presenting next week to the Pennsylvania legislature. I was asked to do it by the Republican caucus on the Senate side, and I said no, only if you can get the Democratic caucus. And they said, good idea. And then some others got involved and said, can we invite the House as well? That would be better. And then some others got involved, can we invite industry? So I think it's the largest sitting legislature in the country. There are over 500. And then the industry, I don't know how many will attend, but I hope a lot, because it's kind of an interesting microcosm with the Marcellus Shale, and then the neighbor to the north, New York, who won't drill that, and pipelines and other big challenges and opportunities. It's going to be fascinating to really engage in that conversation civilly and hopefully, you know, in that radical middle. So I don't know. You know, policy has a way of doing things that are well intended but don't always have good outcomes, and sometimes they do. We'll see. We'll see where it goes. I don't have any predictions about it. If somebody tells me they understand politics, I smile and think, boy, you're better than me. So.
Sure. Well, good luck in that meeting, that presentation. So zooming out kind of globally and thinking about kind of energy transitions, you know, in parts of Africa, Asia, South America, you know, some of these countries moved really quick on things like telecom infrastructure, right? They kind of skipped the West's transition and went straight to cell phones, et cetera. This question asks, do you think that they will be able to skip hydrocarbon energy and jump straight to distributed renewables? And if not, what would be the barriers to that?
Yeah, well, I tried to cover quite a bit of that. And the interesting thing about cell phones, because I grew up in high school in the 70s, so we had one landline in our house with a long stretchy cord, and I hid in the closet to talk to my girlfriend, who is also now my wife. And a cell phone is better. It's better technology. That's why we changed where we had landlines, and that's why we skipped them in developing nations. It's better. The wind and the sun are indeed renewable, but the technology to capture them isn't, as I've shown. Panels and turbines and batteries are not renewable. Take a remarkable amount of mining and manufacturing and disposal because they wear out. So it's not better. It's better for CO2 emissions at the source. There's some CO2 in the process, but not like oil and gas and coal, for sure. But it's not better for land and nature and water necessarily, because so much stuff is needed to capture low density energy. I think, in fact, that we will see, and we filmed that, for distributed renewables in parts of the world, 1 billion people who don't have any, that's the only way to get it distributed. Whether it's the sun and wind, pico hydro, maybe small modular reactors of different kinds, nuclear, natural gas, combinations of these things, absolutely makes great sense. But the grid is following that because you have to have something dispatchable to back up things that are intermittent. That's just the way electricity works. And if you try to do it all with chemical batteries, it's unforeseeable the amount of mining that would be required to do that. And that is a non-renewable resource. Lithium and cobalt and nickel and other things, rare earth elements, are also non-renewable. So I think we have education has to happen, Wade, in that, because skipping dense energy to go back to the sun and the wind, which we had 500 to 1,000 years ago, isn't necessarily forward, just different. And it improves the mix in some ways, and that's a good thing. I mean, really, truly forward is more dense. And that's nuclear, that's uranium and thorium, or perhaps hydrogen, which is a very dense form of energy carrier. And that'll be part of that as well. And I think you're seeing that happen in parts of the world and not others. Those of us who already have a lot of energy are thinking clean means CO2 emissions only. It doesn't to me, but it does to some. And so that's driving the conversation in Western Europe and the US. Just as a reminder, though, 520 million people live in the Western Europe and the US. 520 million. That's less than 7% of the world's population. The other 73 or 93% of the world is fully engaged in dense energy, coal, oil, natural gas. And some of them are starting to transition a little bit, but they're a long way away from it. So no, it's not going to get skipped. And arguably for them, just like the same way we did it, maybe it shouldn't. But boy, if we could accelerate it, that'd be powerful. Accelerate through some things that really are tough on the environment. SOx, NOx, mercury, particulates, CO2 from coal, accelerate through it. Natural gas doesn't have those things except CO2, a little bit of sulfur, hydro, nuclear, and then solar and wind and other things. That transition would be very powerful.
Got it. Understand. Maybe as we wrap up here, a question focusing on a couple things that are maybe emerging. One is somewhat new, one's a little old, but they get a lot of attention today. First is hydrogen. What role do you think it will have? And the second is something a little bit even more germane to the E&P industry, carbon capture storage. Where do you see both of those heading?
Yeah, good questions. And I have, in an hour talk, I put slides in on those things, but, hydrogen, it has a remarkable future. We have to get some infrastructure to make that happen. But it's a great energy carrier, electricity carrier. So for fuel cells in cars, I know Elon calls them fuel cells, but he's conflicted. He's selling batteries, okay? They're not fuel cells. They have a great role to play, and they're zero emissions out of the tailpipe, just like electricity. But in some ways, you can actually clean up the source differently than you can with even the sources of electricity to charge batteries. And then there's storage media too, hydrogen, but it's going to take a lot. It's element number one, very light. You got to be able to create it, split the water molecule or the methane molecule, depending on if you like colors. They call them green and blue and gray hydrogen. I don't think the hydrogen is color coded itself, but that's what we're calling them because people who name things name them very cleverly. But hydrogen has a role to play, hopefully a big role, very dense, and for transportation and as electricity. So a lot of future there. CCUS, it's got a second life. I think most people are realizing coal and oil and gas aren't going away. So you got to capture the emissions out of that and do something with them. Technologically, it can be done. I'm conflicted here. I've had a CCUS group at the Bureau for 20 years, one of the best in the nation. They're very good at this S part, the storage part, and the utilization, EOR. I still think it's expensive, but if you start putting together these things in the right geography, the sources, cement plants and and petrochemicals and refineries and power plants and hydrogen plants all along the Texas coast, for example. Short distance to compress and move it into wells, and big stacks of sediments that aren't that lithified, so it'll take the rate, store the volume of CO2 for a long time. A single owner, the state of Texas or the federal government. You put these together, it makes it more affordable. Get some tax incentives like 45Q, some EOR dollars out from enhanced oil recovery using the CO2. A lot can come together. I think in parts of the world, we're going to see that take off and try to go to scale. And it could be up to 1 billion tons a year. You know, we're in the few millions of tons now, so that's a big lift. Remember, just switching from coal to gas was close to 3 billion tons a year. So CCUS is a wedge, and it could be a good wedge in parts of the world. And by the way, it's a huge industry, massive industry, moving more supercritical fluids than the oil and gas industry moves now in water, if it really goes to big scale. So subsurface understanding, jobs, and other things, both with hydrogen. One of the challenges with hydrogen is storing it. Where are you going to keep it all? Again, a subsurface challenge. So a lot of opportunity for the subsurface extractive industries to figure out how to store things that we have produced.
All right, thank you, Scott. Once again, you've packed a ton into just 1 hour, and thank you for answering these questions. For all of you who did not get your question asked or answered yet, our apologies, but we're at the end of our hour. On behalf of Interplus, we appreciate you joining. I'm grateful you could join. Again, we would put our strong endorsement and plug in for connecting with Scott and connecting with Switch Energy Alliance. I think you'll find a tremendous resource there with that group and the website. And so we'll go ahead and bring our meeting to a close, and thank everyone again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.